by thanking George and Heather very much for inviting me to Cambridge. It's really great to be here, great to see friends, and great to have the opportunity to participate in this series. I know that the lectures and eventually the written versions of these readings will be a very stimulating and important point of reference for many of us, I think, and many of our students over the coming years. So congratulations to both of you on all your hard work on the project as well. So my three cantos are the 17s, and they form, in effect, the central column of Dante's comedy. In both the second and third cantiche of the poem, the Purgatorio and the Paradiso, each of which comprises 33 cantos. They're obviously preceded and followed by 16 cantos, so they form the central canto in each of those cases. And as we know, Dante was highly attentive to structural features and symmetries within his works. And so it's no surprise that he attributes a particular importance to these central units of the poem. Each is foregrounded and privileged, I think, both in terms of its relationship to the broader structure and architecture of the Commedia, and in terms of its highly significant narrative, thematic, and philosophical content. While these are all pivotal cantos, then, I don't think there's a single dominant unifying theme here, as there perhaps is with the sixes, with the 10s, the 15s. But having looked closely at the cantos, I think there are certainly a number of threads which can be traced through them, and these range from fairly small subtle lexical or metaphorical interconnections to broader thematic or narrative symmetries and oppositions, to structural affinities, and finally mythological figures who are seemingly used programmatically over the course of this vertical sequence. And I think in different ways these various elements shed light on wider tensions between the different emphases of these cantos and indeed the cantiche in which they're situated. And they make a vertical reading an illuminating and productive exercise. So several of the previous speakers have done an excellent job of evaluating, I think, the method of vertical reading, its benefits, its limitations, its critical precedents. So I don't feel there's any need for me to repeat that work. I want to spend as much time as possible on my three cantos. And that's not least because they're all extremely rich and significant ones, and in what I suspect is becoming a very familiar caveat to these lectures. I should point out immediately that I won't be able to do anything like justice to all three of them in an hour, and I'll have to be quite selective in the elements that I focus on. So essentially I'm going to do three things with relation to this sequence of cantos. I want to just begin by refreshing everybody's memories by giving a short synopsis of each canto and some of the questions that each one raises. Secondly, I want to give an overview of some of the ways in which I think the cantos might lend themselves to a vertical analysis, some of their interconnections. And finally, I want to offer a reading of the three cantos in terms of how, collectively, they throw into relief the poem's title, Commedia, and its significance. So I'll begin with a quick overview of each canto. Inferno 17 is, above all, it's a canto of narrative transition. It begins in the third and final section of the circle of violence, the seventh circle of hell, and recounts the dramatic descent of Dante Pilgrim and Virgil into the eighth circle, that of fraud, on the back of the beast Geryon. So we in fact see the sort of three main passages of the canto in this image. So Geryon, who first appears at the end of Canto 16, is a mythological creature, often described in classical texts as being a monster with human faces. And Dante manipulates various classical precedents to turn Geryon into a representation of the sin of fraud, quella sozza immagine di froda, as he calls him in line 7. His benign countenance, his faccia d'uom giusto, tanto benigna, distracts us from his serpentine body and his scorpion's tail, la venenosa forca, che a guisa di scorpion la punta armava. So you can see there the rather sinister human face on the serpentine form. And distracting too, as well as the benign countenance of Geryon, are the vivid and extravagant colours and patterns which Dante says adorn Geryon's flanks, and he compares these to sort of extravagant textiles. So, as a creature, Geryon maps out spatially the manner in which fraudulent discourses and deeds unfold. The righteous countenance and seductive colours, whether rhetorical or visual, lure us in until the fraudulent deed is done. Now, there's certainly more to Geryon than this, and he's received a huge amount of critical attention, considered not only in terms of his embodiment of fraud, but also as a meditation on language and textuality. And he's been read by some critics, moreover, as a self-conscious representation of the poem itself, or else as the poem's negative image. And we'll come back to some of these questions a little bit later on. But Geryon is certainly a creature who's been read in a whole number of different ways, some of which I think are sort of in tension with one another, some of which I think complement one another. So the introduction of Geryon is followed by Dante's encounter with the usurers or the moneylenders, the final group of souls guilty of a violence against God or against nature. So these are the figures we see on the right-hand side. The charging of interest upon loans, an activity strongly associated, of course, with Dante's Florence, was seen as defying the natural law, whereby reward should follow corresponding toil. And the usurers in hell are accordingly stationary. As Robert Holland describes them, unmoved movers hunched over their desks in pursuit of gain. So they're extremely static, the way they appear here in hell. And from the neck of each usurer hangs a pouch, reminiscent of a money bag, which bears the coat of arms of the family of the usurer in question. And upon this bag, each soul very much fixes his gaze. And Dante is entrusted by Virgil with the task of encountering the usurers alone, so without the need for Virgil's guidance. And Virgil uses this interlude while Dante is dealing with the usurers independently to prepare Geryon to carry them down the waterfall into the circle of violence, or Malebolge, below. The descent itself takes up the final third of the canto. And on the one hand, this is simply a moment of kind of visceral narrative drama, as Dante describes the hair-raising flight and the fear that it provoked within him. But amidst this drama, we find very significant allusions to two mythological figures, Phaeton and Icarus, known to Dante principally through Ovid. Now, we'll look at these allusions in more detail later, not least because Phaeton is certainly present in Inferno 17 and Paradiso 17, possibly also in Purgatorio 17. But in essence, what Dante does is he compares his own fear to that of these two classical figures. But what's clearly very important is the implicit contrast that he's asking us to consider here between these two pagan flights, which serve as examples of a prideful overreaching which ends tragically, and Dante's divinely willed flight, which ends happily, with Dante and Virgil successfully deposited in Malebolge. So we see here, sort of in microcosm, the opposition between a tragic pagan worldview, lacking an underlying principle of salvation, and the redemptive Christian vision of Dante's comedy. Purgatorio 17, like Inferno 17, straddles two zones of the realm in question, this time moving from the terrace of the wrathful, the last terrace devoted to sins of misdirected love, to the terrace of sloth, a sin of insufficient love, or lento amor, as Dante will put it later. Once again, we can, I think, quite usefully divide the canto into three. In fact, that's what we did in the workshop earlier. Dante, in the first part, experiences a series of ecstatic visions in which he perceives three exemplars of destructive anger. The first is taken from Ovid's Metamorphoses. These are very Ovidian cantos. I think that's one of the ways in which they're certainly connected. With the figure, probably if Procne, it could also be Philomela. There's some doubt. There's some debate about that. Haman from the Book of Esther, and Amata, mother of Lavinia, in Virgil's Aeneid. I'm not going to delve into these exemplars in great detail, so I'm glad we had the opportunity to do that in the workshop. But the visions collectively are of interest, I think, when thinking across the Cantiche, because as several scholars have explored, the description of these visions, of these experiences, anticipates the visionary qualities of the poetry of the Paradiso, and especially the beatific vision, which is described in the very last canto of the poem. There are several correspondences in the way in which Dante describes these visions and the one he will have there. The middle third of this canto describes Dante and Virgil receiving the blessing from the angel of meekness, and they continue their ascent before stopping wearily as we reach the terrace of sloth. The sun is setting at this point, and Dante and Virgil seem to be sort of afflicted by the sloth which will be the subject of this terrace. And rather like the narrative pause in Inferno 11, where Virgil had explained to Dante the moral order of hell, this pause provides the opportunity for one of the most important philosophical discourses of the entire poem, taking up the last 50 or so lines of the canto. And this is Virgil's discussion of love and how it informs the moral structure of purgatory. It's of course no coincidence that this discourse is found at the very midpoint, not only of Purgatorio, but of the entire Commedia, because love not only provides the rationale for the ordering of purgatory, which is a notion delineated at the end of the canto, but is also the fulcrum of Dante's moral universe. As Virgil tells Dante, Quinci comprender puoi ch'esser convenne, amor sementa in voi d'ogni virtute ed ogni operazione che merita pene. So, love is the seed of every virtue and ultimately the source of every act which merits punishment. So to summarise this integral doctrine, Virgil presents love, amor, as present in every being, encompassing both creature and creator, but draws a distinction in humans between natural and elective forms of love. Ne creator ne creatura mai filiuol fu senza amore, o natural o d'animo. While natural love always orients itself towards the highest good, and for humans this means God, elective love, amore d'animo, is subjected to free will, and may thus err either in its chosen object or in its degree, leading us, in either case, to sin. Such sin falls into three categories: misdirected love, insufficient love, and excessive love of secondary goods. And these inform the three categories of these inform the triform structure of Dante's Purgatorio. The first three cardinal sins, pride, envy, wrath, are considered instances of misdirected love. The fourth, sloth, is a sole form of insufficient love, and the final three sins, avarice, gluttony, lust, all exemplify an inordinate love of secondary goods. This doctrine, and in particular the unwavering influence of free will in the ambit of desire, will be further developed in the next canto, Canto 18. Finally, Paradiso 17 constitutes one of the culminating moments of the entire Commedia. It's the third of three cantos dedicated to Dante's encounter with his great-great-grandfather, the crusader Cacciaguida, in the heaven of Mars. While the previous two cantos had focused primarily on Cacciaguida's story and the former glories and the current vicissitudes of the city of Florence, Canto 17 features two powerful and climactic messages from Dante's ancestor. First, he gives the culminating prophecy of Dante's painful exile from Florence, often seen as completing the prophecy of another paternal figure, Brunetto Latini in Inferno 15. But unlike the infernal prophecies, Cacciaguida's is no longer obscure, couched in ambage, but articulated in chiare parole e preciso Latin. Dante is told of the pain, poverty, and humiliation that await him, the patrons who will protect him, and the erstwhile political allies who will betray him. Yet this experience of exile will be bittersweet, because Cacciaguida spells out explicitly what has been largely implicit in the poem, and that's that Dante's journey has had in effect a dual purpose. Not only has it been a salvific one from his own individual perspective, but it served as the basis for a divinely sanctioned poem, to be written for the moral, spiritual, and we might say political edification of the mondo che mal vive, the world that lives amiss, as Beatrice puts it in the Earthly Paradise. Dante's instructed that his poem must be unswervingly truthful, must forswear all falsehood, must not fear the consequences of its powerful and provocative content. Exile, indeed, becomes the requisite platform for Dante in writing the uncompromising poem. Now detached from civic and party political allegiances, he can speak candidly, truthfully, and objectively. Cacciaguida explains to Dante finally that the characters he's encountered on this journey have been selected in order to provide the most potent and the most effective examples to his future readers. Like the descent on Geryon, the encounter with Cacciaguida is framed by a series of allusions again to classical figures. The Cacciaguida episode, is introduced in Paradiso 15 with an allusion to the encounter between Aeneas and his father Anchises in the underworld, as described in Book 6 of Virgil's Aeneid. Just as Anchises provides Aeneas with a bittersweet prophecy of the personal loss and imperial glory associated with his mission of founding a new Troy, Rome, so Cacciaguida tempers his forecast of Dante's forthcoming exile with news of the poetic glory that awaits him. The entire Cacciaguida episode, I think, demands to be read in this key, in close dialogue with the Virgilian text. Moreover, in Canto 17 specifically, Dante again compares himself to two Ovidian figures. Once again to Phaeton, who we saw back in Inferno 17. Phaeton, who sought assurances from his mother Clymene that Apollo was his father, and to Hippolytus, unjustly exiled from Athens. And again, each of these figures ostensibly appears as a kind of figura Dantis, an analogue of Dante. But as in Inferno, in each case, Dante is also asking us to consider, I think, the tensions between the situation of his Christian protagonists and those of these pagan alter egos. So having set out some of the most important episodes, themes and implications of these cantos, I want to think about some of the ways, more broadly to begin with, which we might consider them in terms of their vertical interrelation. What are some of the correspondences, the affinities, the echoes and tensions that exist between these three discrete subsections of the poem? Well, the first question I'd like to consider is structure. As I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, Purgatorio and Paradiso 17 are the central cantos of their respective cantiche. The centrality of Inferno 17 is rather less pronounced, of course, because the Inferno has 34 rather than 33 cantos, and so the midpoint technically falls between 17 and 18 rather in 17. It therefore seems no coincidence that Dante chooses to situate in Purgatorio 17 and Paradiso 17 moments of profound doctrinal and narrative importance. First, Virgil's doctrine of love, which informs the structure of Purgatorio and underpins Dante's moral universe. Derling and Martinez described in their commentary as the central principle of all things, as well as the central problem of human life. And then in Paradiso 17, Cacciaguida's climactic prophecy and his instructions to Dante to write his poem. So these are evidently moments of great importance, not only in the context of their respective cantos, but also in terms of our understanding of the poem as a whole. And Dante is evidently placing them on a kind of narrative and structural pedestal by placing them in these central cantos. The exact midpoint, as has been pointed out by several commentators, of the Commedia is line 125 of Canto 17, and this in fact falls at the exact midpoint of Virgil's discourse on love. So it just underlines the centrality that Dante is attaching to it. But this sense of centrality is reinforced by structural and numerological features noted by critics, and especially in the case of Purgatorio by Charles Singleton. What Singleton notes is the symmetrical, I'm going to say this very slowly because it's quite complicated and gets quite nerdy in a moment. The symmetrical disposition of the number of lines belonging to each of the 7 cantos which surround Canto 17. So clearly this is Canto 17, and these are the line numbers associated with the surrounding cantos, and they evidently form a symmetrical pattern. This cluster of 7 is reinforced by the 7s which we are given by the addition of the numbers 151, which we get at the sort of bracketing ends of this sequence, and furthermore at the centre of Cantos 16 and 18, either side of the present canto, we find key and corresponding references to free will in lines 70 to 72 of sorry, I should say 16, and in lines 73 to 75 of 18. So it just reinforces this sense of a kind of very carefully structured sequence and structure. And moreover, each of these references to free will is preceded and followed by 25 terzine. And Singleton regards this highly contrived numerological sequence as a kind of signature at the very core of the Commedia, marking its completeness and its perfection, an affirmation of order which corresponds to the reordering of errant desire, which is the essence of this second cantica. As Durling and Martinez note as well, the dominant number 7, sort of embedded into this central and crucial sequence, is an especially resonant one in medieval culture because it evokes, for example, the planets, the vices and virtues. Of course, 7 is built into Purgatorio in terms of the 7 deadly sins as well. The sacraments, the ecclesiastical orders and the liberal arts. And Paradiso 17.2 is framed by a numerological pattern which highlights its mathematical as well as its narrative centrality, as has been explored by Giorgio Brugnoli and John Logan. And again, a pattern can be traced in the number of lines in the cantos surrounding 17. But this time not in terms of the number of lines themselves, but in the total, definitely going to say this a bit slowly, the total we get from adding together the 3 digits in question. So for example, in Canto 17, 1, 4, 2 add up to make 7. If you follow that through 1, 3, 6, 10, 1, 4, 8, 13, you'll see that they form a symmetrical sequence. And if you, once you read, and this is just to show that this is the point at which the sequence breaks down. So clearly then there's a profound concern with structure and numerology, and that's something that connects these cantos, or at least Purgatorio 17 and Paradiso 17, and this is evidently with a view to elevating, privileging, and in a sense framing their pivotal narrative and doctrinal content. Now to move on to some more thematic questions. Motion, and in particular images of ascent and descent, I think plays a very important role in all 3 cantiche. The ascent followed by the descent of Geryon in Inferno 16 and 17, which we see here, venir notando una figura in suso, and then obviously discende, ultimately with the great descent down the waterfall. In Purgatorio 17, the ecstatic visions which fall like raindrops into Dante's fantasy, piove dentro all'alta fantasia, before breaking up like rising bubbles, a guisa d'una bulla, qui manca l'acqua sotto qual si feo, surse mia visione. Naturally, the toilsome ascent of Virgil and Dante up Mount Poetry itself, which is very much highlighted in this canto. And finally, in Paradiso 17, the touching image of Dante forlornly ascending and descending the staircase of his patrons in exile. Come durro calle lo scendere e il salir per l'altrui scalle. And these are linked moreover by references to stairs in all 3 cantos. Geryon is described by Virgil as precisely a staircase, si scende per si fatte scale, in light of his role of lowering the pilgrim and his guide into Malebolge. We find the angel of meekness in Purgatorio 17 at the top of a staircase to be ascended, volgemo I nostri passi ad una scala, and finally in Paradiso 17 we have that staircase to be wearily mounted and ascended by the exiled Dante. And these staircases thus pertain in sequence to infernal descent, purgatorial ascent, and finally to ascent and descent, the forlorn and repetitive rhythms of worldly existence and hopes unfulfilled. And this last instance might be contrasted to the inexorable ascent and elevation towards the divine, which is associated with yet another staircase, which is the one we find in the heaven of Saturn, associated with contemplative wisdom. The 17s, I think, certainly seem interconnected by common metaphorical and semantic fields. Nautical imagery plays an important part in all 3 cases. Geryon, at the start of their descent, is likened at first to a docked boat, as we see here, come talvolta stanno a riva I burchi, che parte sono in acqua e parte in terra. then to a boat leaving its port, come la navicella esce di loco, indietro, indietro, si quindi si tolse, and implicitly to a marine creature during the descent itself, as we see in the next two quotations there in the middle. And the first two of these three, I think, resonate very strongly in Purgatorio 17, where Dante, we discussed this earlier, Dante and Virgil come to a stop, pur come nave che alla piaggia arriva, like a boat coming to shore. And as with the staircases, we see an inversion of the use of the metaphor from one cantica to the next. Here, la navicella esce di loco in hell, and then come nave che alla piaggia arriva. So reflecting the Purgatorio's wider concern with homecoming and an overcoming of distance and estrangement. And there's a prominent nautical simile also in Paradiso 17, used in an analogy to articulate the distinction between foreknowledge and predestination, which is the last quotation here. Necessità però quindi non prende, se non come dal viso in che si specchia, nave che per torrente giù discende. So just as a ship travelling downstream is not propelled by the eye of the observer, so God's knowledge of future events does not determine them. So clearly nautical images play an important role in each canto. Another, I think, interesting and prominent field exploited in each, metaphorical field exploited in each canto is that of weaving. And weaving is for Dante, as for other classical and medieval authors, often related to questions of language and of storytelling. And metaphors of weaving and textiles are often deployed in the Commedia in important metapoetic moments. There's a PhD student in Bristol who's currently working on the relationship between weaving and poetics in the medieval and Renaissance period, looking at Dante and Ariosto in particular, but it seems a sort of enduring and very sophisticated use of that metaphor in these poetic contexts, and in the classical period as well. In the description of Geryon in Inferno 17, the monster's extravagantly coloured body is compared to vivid Turkish and Tatar textiles, and to those created by the mythological master weaver Arachne. So con più color sommesse e sovrapposte, non fermai drappi tartari né turchi, ne fortai telle per aragne imposte. So Dante here deploys quite a particular vocabulary of weaving, sommesse, sovrapposte, and drappi, telle, imposte. And he does so too in Paradiso 17. As Cacciaguida finishes his first speech in that canto, Dante describes himself as having, and I quote the Hollander translation, done with putting the woof into the web for which I had set the warp. Poiché tacendo si mostrò spedita l'anima santa di metter la trama in quella tela che io le porsi ordita. So the metaphor is quite an obscure, quite a complex one, certainly to me. But in essence what Cacciaguida is describing is that in finishing answering the pilgrim's question, which is described as the warp, the fixed threads which we find on the sort of background of the future tapestry, he covers those with his response, which is the weft, and has completed thus the patterned textile. So sort of question and answer together form the sort of the unified whole. And I think this metaphor implicitly figures the text of the Commedia as a kind of tapestry of voices and texts coming together to form a united and coherent whole, with Dante the poet here as the master weaver who unifies the disparate parts. And the myth of Procne and Philomela, which was also evoked as one of the exemplars of wrath in Purgatorio 17, is concerned with weaving. Procne killed her son in her act of wrath after her Scylla, Philomela, had told her through images on a tapestry that Procne's husband Tereus had raped her and cut out her tongue. So we have two famous mythological weavers in Inferno 17 and Purgatorio 17, followed in Paradiso 17 by a metaphor which figures Dante himself as a weaver and the Commedia as a tapestry. So we'll come back to a couple of those things a little bit later. Alimentary metaphors, I think, are also prominent in the 17s, and in particular with reference to processes of learning, knowing, understanding. First, in Purgatorio 17, Virgil tells Dante to pay close attention to his discourse on love, to benefit from the pause in their ascent. Volgi la mente a me e prenderai alcun buon frutto di nostra dimora. In Paradiso 17, Dante talks about the bitter taste his words may have if he candidly retells what he has seen. O io ho appreso quel che se io ridico a molti fia sapor di forte agrume. And then Cacciaguida uses a further alimentary metaphor in describing the effects of Dante's parola brusca, his uncompromising speech, upon his future audience. Che se la voce tua sarà molesta nel primo gusto, vital nodrimento lascerà poi quando sarà digesta. The Inferno 17 and Purgatorio 17 also share important metaphors of errant deviation. And this is noted by Derling and Martinez in the Intercanticas section of their edition of the Purgatorio. Words like disvia, sfiare, s'abbandona, si torce, as well as references to brakes, freni, not prudently deployed. In the infernal context, these words apply to the errant flights of Phaeton and Icarus, which veer off course. And in the Purgatorio, they relate foremost to errant desires, to loves which al mal si torce, or l'amor caresso troppo s'abbandona. But in both cases, we find an emphasis on dangers of imprudence, excess, or a lack of fortitude, or a failure to submit to authority or guidance of some kind. Now, this deviation contrasts with the inexorable movement and the comic arc of the poem itself, which, sanctioned by God, does not veer or crash, but rather arrives unerringly at its destination. A narrative arc which we see represented emblematically in the flight of Geryon, and its movement from fear and uncertainty to satisfaction and resolution. This movement from fear to resolution is moreover evident in Paradiso 17, which begins with Dante fearing for his future due to the parole gravi he has heard below, but ends with his fears placated and with a reinforced sense of certainty and of poetic and spiritual vocation. So in other words, the successful flight of Geryon and the powerful certainties offered by Cacciaguida encapsulate the poem's wider movement towards comic resolution. The fact that both unfold in the shadow of much more ambiguous or tragic pagan myths, the mad flights of Phaeton and Icarus, the unjust exile of Hippolytus, which is untempered by spiritual redemption, underlines the key distinction between Christian comedy and pagan tragedy, which Dante is obviously very concerned with throughout his poem. And we'll come back to this later, because I think it's a really key aspect of the 17s. One last thematic point of contact between the 17s is the question of Dante's growing autonomy, as both pilgrim and poet. It's noteworthy that in Inferno 17, Virgil, occupied in taking care of Geryon, preparing Geryon for their descent, trusts Dante for the first time to encounter a group of sinners, the usurers, all alone. So, a ciò che tutta piena esperienza d'esto giron porti, va e vedi la lor mena. So Dante proceeds to encounter the usurers independently and autonomously. Tutto solo andai, dove sedea la gente mesta. And this serves an indication, I think, of his mastery of sins of violence. Having earlier felt compassion at the beginning of this circle towards Pier della Vigna, Brunetto Latini, he's wholly dispassionate when confronted by the usurers. And Paradiso 17 is also concerned with conferring a sort of autonomy onto Dante, but this time Dante the poet. Cacciaguida famously commands Dante to embrace the isolation which he will be his in exile, and rather than aligning himself with his white Guelph companions, la compagnia malvagia e scempia, tutta ingrata, tutta matta e empia, it will behove him to form a party of himself alone. Sic a te fia bello averti fatta parte per te stesso. And this radical autonomy is the necessary platform for the author of the Commedia, so that he may speak those candid, objective truths in a non-partisan manner, condemning Guelphs and Ghibellines alike, in reaffirming the common purpose of all humanity. So the journey undertaken by the pilgrim in the Commedia in order to become the poet is necessarily one of emancipation from party political as well as sinful bonds, of gaining political and moral autonomy. And I think both of those elements are strongly present here. So I wanted to give this kind of overview, first of all, of the interconnection to show that they're quite numerous, whether structural, lexical, metaphorical, narrative, thematic. There are lots of ways, I think, in which these cantos are connected, and I'm not suggesting here that I've anything like exhausted them. And I think any of these fields, obviously, we could explore in more depth. But in the remaining time, I just want to give a short reading of the three cantos, which focuses principally on two interrelated questions. Firstly, the relationship between Geryon as sotto immagine di frode and Cacciaguida's instructions to Dante in the Paradiso. And secondly, the cluster of mythological and indeed Ovidian figures with whom Dante establishes both analogies and contrasts in these cantos, and in particular Phaeton, Icarus and Arachne. And I want to consider these things especially in light of the poem's title, Comedy. Now I think the title is a matter of particular importance when thinking about the 17s, because if I'm permitted to step outside the 17s for just a second, the description of Geryon in Inferno is preceded, perhaps prefaced, by a key passage in which Dante refers to his poem for the very first time as a comedy. And so Inferno 17 unfolds in light of this notion, which we take for granted, but a first-time reader of the text wouldn't, that we should understand this text as a commedia, as Dante puts it here. And it comes as Dante, the narrator, insists upon the literal truth of perhaps the most melodramatic and implausible moment of the entire Inferno. So sempre a quel ver che faccia di menzogna, dell'uom chiuder le labbra finché il puote, però che senza colpa fa vergogna. Ma qui tacer non posso, e per le notte di questa commedia le torti giuro, se le non siendi lunga grazia vote, chi vidi per quell'aire grosso e scuro, venir notando una figura in suso, maravigliosa ad ogni cor sicuro. So I'll just read Robin's translation of this passage. Always to every truth that looks in face like lies, one ought quite firmly, bar the lip, less guiltless, what one says should still bring shame. I cannot though be silent here. Reader, I swear by every rhyme this comedy has caused to chime, may it not long lack favour, that now, through dark and fatty air, I saw, to strike sheer wonder in the steadiest heart, approaching us, a figure swimming up, etc. So Dante swears upon the very poem itself, per le notte di questa commedia, that this sight of the monstrous Geryon swimming through the air towards him was one truly experienced. And keywords are surely quel ver che faccia di menzogna, a truth which has the face of a lie, words which encapsulate Dante's presentation of the comedy as a whole. As Teodolinda Barolini puts it, although a commedia may at times, as when presenting Geryon, have the face of a lie, give the appearance of lying, it is intractably always truth. And this designation is crucial as it prefaces the representation of the fraudulent Geryon in Canto 17, the creature whose countenance exudes honesty and truthfulness, but whose nature is evidently mendacious. Where Dante's poem is fashioned as a truth with the face of a lie, Geryon is evidently a lie with the face of truth, la sozza immagine di froda, but with la faccia d'uom giusto, tanta benigna. So the commedia is here placed in clear opposition to fraud of this kind. But why does Dante call his poem a commedia? Well, according to the epistle to Can Grande della Scala, there are two principal reasons, one which we might term narrative and the other sort of linguistic or stylistic. Now, firstly, in terms of narrative, the author of the epistle writes that comedy is a certain kind of poetical narration which differs from all others. It differs from tragedy in its subject matter, in that tragedy at the beginning is admirable and placid, but at the end or issue, maybe that's a typo, is foul and horrible. Whereas comedy begins with sundry adverse conditions, but ends happily, as appears from the comedies of Terence. The two forms of poetical narration, then, comedy and tragedy, differ insofar as tragedy begins in favourable circumstances but ends in chaos, whereas comedy begins in adversity but ends in satisfaction and resolution. Naturally, in the case of the Commedia, this comic narrative arc concerns the journey from the selva oscura of sin and confusion to salvation and the vision of God at the culmination of the Paradiso. And secondly, in terms of language, the epistle states, tragedy and comedy, and again Dante is evidently very concerned with this, the relationship between these two modes. Tragedy and comedy differ likewise in their style of language, for that of tragedy is high-flown and sublime, while that of comedy is unstudied and lowly. As has been widely explored by Dante scholars, the lowly and humble style of the Commedia can be considered both in terms of the fact that it is written, of course, in the vernacular rather than Latin, but also in terms of its non-adherence to vernacular norms, comedy being the most sort of wide-reaching and flexible stylistic category. Its approach is defined by its breadth and flexibility, its capacity to draw on a full spectrum of language in order to communicate as faithfully as possible the nature of a journey which encompasses the extremes of the created universe. Now, it seems to me that each of these aspects of comedy, both the narrative and the stylistic, comes strongly to the fore in the 17s, and particularly when we read them in light of one another. I think we can see the 17s, the core cantos of the poem, as profoundly concerned with one of its core questions, which is what defines this work as comedy. Let's start with the question of language. As shown by Barolini, Geryon, as a representation of fraud, is one highly attentive to questions of language and textuality. So this passage that we looked at a little bit earlier, lodosso il petto e ambidue le coste, dipinti avea di nodi e di rotelle, con più color sommesse e sovrapposte, non fermai drappi tartari ne turchi, ne furtai telle per aragne imposte. So the references to nodi, to colori, to weaving here, all evoke in Dante's work language and textuality. And for Barolini, Arachne, who's evoked here, is the mythological figure who, more than any other, is an emblem for textuality, for weaving the webs of discourse. In such a way, the linguistic dimension of fraud here is being very much placed to the fore. And if Geryon is to some extent a meditation on language and fraudulent language, with what kind of language is he associated? Well, it would seem to be, on the basis of these lines, an ornate, a seductive, and a highly rhetorical language. Such an interpretation would anticipate the seductive but specious language associated with the seducers and the flatterers in the very next canto. The Ovidian Jason and his manipulative parole ornate, which we see in this quotation from Canto 18, and the flatterers who wallow in excrement which reflects their worthless sycophancy. It's clear then that Dante is highly conscious of the often specious quality of highly ornate language. And we can see this in other contexts too. In the Vita Nuova, chapter 25, he sort of scorns poets who can't account for their colori retorici. If you think of Purgatorio 24, he's concerned with the contrivance of certain poets who have failed to achieve the spontaneity of poetic expression, the expression of love associated with his own verse. But I think these words take on an extra significance when we consider them in light of Cacciaguida's exhortations to Dante in Paradiso 17. I think Geryon and Inferno 17 is present very much in the background of that passage as the negative image of the kind of poetry which Cacciaguida demands. So Dante tells Cacciaguida of a dilemma he faces. On the one hand, he fears his words, if fully truthful, may leave a bitter taste among his readers and perhaps his future patrons. But on the other hand, if he remains a timid friend to truth, se io al vero sono timido amico, he risks compromising his poetic legacy and the transformative potential of his poem. Now, in response, Cacciaguida urges Dante unequivocally to remain steadfastly committed to truth. Coscienza fusca o della propria o d'altrui vergogna, pur sentirà la tua parola brusca, ma non di men rimossa ogni menzogna, tutta tua vision fa manifesta, e lascia pur grattar dove la rogna, che se la voce tua sarà molesta nel primo gusto, vita al nodrimento lascerà poi, quando sarà digesta. So, as expressed so memorably in these lines, Dante's poem must be purged of every falsehood in its revelation of Dante's vision. As in Inferno 16 and 17, then the Commedia is powerfully aligned with truth. And such unswerving commitment to il vero will, however, render the comedy a difficult and abrasive text. Its truths, we learn here, are frequently unpalatable ones, especially for those dark of conscience. Yet, the uncomfortable pang of recognition felt by its reader will testify to the poem's success, its capacity to instigate change. So if we think of these lines alongside the description of Geryon in Inferno 17, we're presented with two antithetical forms of discourse. The false benevolence of the fraudster as compared to the brusque hostility of Dante the poet. The mendacious eloquence of fraud as compared to the direct and sometimes coarse truthfulness of the comedy. The hidden but the lethal sting, which is the outcome of the fraudulent deal, as compared to the prick of conscience, which will make the reader scratch where they feel an itch. Stimolati, and I think also Inferno 3 here, where Dante refers to the stings of wasps in the context of kind of the sting of conscience. The uncompromising commitment to truth demanded by Cacciaguida is moreover intimately related to Dante's designation of his poem as a humble comedy. Cacciaguida's words are themselves a model of plain-speaking frankness in expressing important truths, not least in that expression lascia pur grattar dove la rogna, let them scratch where they feel an itch. And this very harsh and corporeal language serves almost as a model for Dante's own elastic use of style and register in his comedies. Wouldn't be the language Virgil would use in this situation. And it's a work which must be beholden only to truth and not to arbitrary stylistic and rhetorical norms. At the other end of the linguistic spectrum are the highly rhetorical and embellished falsehoods, the parole ornate associated with Geryon and the fraudulent sinners who follow him. Parole ornate, that word that is associated here with Jason in Inferno 18, is also strongly associated in the Commedia with Virgil, with Virgilian eloquence, because it's on account of his parole ornata that Virgil is commissioned by Beatrice to serve as Dante's guide through the Inferno. And parole ornate is associated with the high, tragic, rather stiff style, the alta tragedia, with which Virgil is synonymous in the poem. A stylistic mode in opposition to which the fluid vernacular commedia is constantly situated. And this opposition is also often seen in terms of truth and falsehood. Dante is often tainting Virgil's poem in one way or another with accusations of falsehood. And I think it could be seen as mendacious in two ways, Virgil's poem here. Firstly, on account of the fact that Dante's poem treats of a Christian subject matter which is inaccessible to Virgil, therefore associated with the Dei falsi bugiardi, Virgil's poem. But also in Dante's poem, in using language more freely than alta tragedia, it's inherently less mendacious. It can approximate reality more faithfully and more truthfully. So in short, Inferno 17 and Paradiso 17 plot two forms of discourse against one another: the ornate, seductive, yet mendacious speech of the fraudulent, and the more unpalatable, humble, yet innately veracious speech of the comedy. The one is defined in the 17s in direct opposition to the other. And we can also think of this opposition in terms of the weaving references present in both cantos, for the prominent references invite us to draw a comparison, I think. Associated with Geryon is the transgressive art of Arachne, again known to Dante through Ovid. Arachne was guilty of hubris in her weaving contest with the goddess Minerva, punished by being turned into a spider for her brilliant but irreverent tapestries of the pagan gods. Dante's tapestry, by contrast, is aligned with and not in defiance of divine authority. You could also think of Procne and Philomela, the tapestry that's sort of at stake there is one which instigates chaos, violence, revenge, as opposed to the vita al nutrimento that will be brought about by Dante's tapestry poem. So clearly as well, I think in these weaving references in the 17, Dante is presenting us with a very different type of tapestry, something that's correcting a correction of those previous precedents. But as we saw in the Epistle to Can Grande, comedy is not only a question of language, but also a question of narrative. To quote the Epistle again, in that tragedy at the beginning is admirable and placid, but at the end is foul and horrible, whereas comedy begins with sundry adverse conditions, but ends happily. So the epistle sets out here an opposition which Dante returns to insistently in the Commedia, between tragedy and comedy, and between pagan and Christian worldviews. Pagan tragedy is, of course, powerfully associated with the figure of Virgil, who must return to limbo, who doesn't have Christian faith. But the opposition appears particularly pronounced in the 17s. And I discussed earlier how both Inferno 17 and Paradiso 17 feature a common narrative movement from fear and uncertainty to resolution, in light of the successful flight of Geryon and the reassuring words of Cacciaguida. But this comic dimension of the work, of the poem, is brought into sharper relief by the unusual concentration of classical figures which feature in the 17s. Perhaps the most pertinent of these are Phaeton and Icarus. Phaeton features at key moments in Inferno 17 and Paradiso 17, and according to Kevin Brownlee, who's analysed very closely this, the programmatic use of Phaeton over the course of the Commedia, is also evoked implicitly in Purgatorio 17. So he perhaps, Phaeton, represents the most prominent link, explicit link between the three 17s. So just to recap his story, in Book 2 of Ovid's Metamorphoses, Phaeton is the son of the solar deity Apollo and the sea nymph Clymene. Challenged by his friends, Phaeton went to his mother to seek reassurances as to the fact he was indeed the son of the sun god. And she duly reassured him and sent him to his father for further reassurance. Phaeton then asked his father for some proof of his relation to the sun, and Apollo obliged and allowed Phaeton to ride the sun chariot for a day. But this flight ends in catastrophe, with Phaeton, terrified by the constellation of Scorpio, dropping the chariot's reins and risking scorching the earth before being felled and killed by a thunderbolt from Zeus. So it's a story which encapsulates notions of human presumption and pride, of sort of wayward self-sufficiency, especially in the face of divine power and authority. And as alluded to earlier, it's Phaeton's flight which features in Inferno 17, as Dante compares his fear to that of Phaeton when he lost control of the sun chariot. So, maggior paura non credo che fosse quando Fetonte abbandonò li freni perché il ciel come par ancor si cosse. While the emotion of fear is common to the two figures, the wider circumstances of the episodes clearly are distinct, and Dante is prompting us to reflect on the opposition. While Phaeton, to his cost, is heedless of the dangers of this flight, Dante submits to his guide Virgil, who embodies rational and temperate discretion. And Brownlee notes that while the unguided Phaeton's downfall is brought about by Scorpio, the constellation, Dante Pilgrim is protected from Geryon's scorpion tail by his guide Virgil. So we see on a number of levels Dante kind of inverting this pagan myth, and sort of, especially its tragic properties. In Paradiso 17, Dante, in seeking reassurances from Cacciaguida following the obscure but menacing prophecies heard in the previous two cantos, now compares himself to Phaeton, seeking reassurances from his mother Clymene. Qual venne a Clymene per accertarsi di ciò che avea incontro a sé udito, quei che ancor fa li padri ai figli scarsi, tale era io, e tale era sentito e da Beatrice e dalla santa lampa che pria per me avea mutato sito. So we see another inversion of the Ovidian model here, because what Brownlee shows is that where Phaeton goes to his mother to seek reassurances about his past, Dante goes to a paternal figure, Cacciaguida, to seek reassurances about his future. There's a third allusion he notes, Brownlee, where Dante appears before the angel of meekness, and the luminosity of the angel, which is very similar to the way in which the luminosity of Apollo is described before Phaeton. And so if we take the 3 episodes across the 70s, we see the Ovidian order as a whole is inverted. We move from Phaeton's flight to his appearance to Apollo, before Apollo, to his appearance before his mother. Whereas in the classical texts, everything unfolds in the opposing order. And clearly this emphasis on inversion points to the fact that Dante, as so often in his Virgilian and Ovidian allusions and rewritings, seeks to confer a new Christian significance onto a pre-existing classical text, to metamorphose a pagan tragedy into a Christian comedy. And inversion is also very clearly at stake in the case of Icarus, whose very much more famous and fateful flight, like Phaeton's, is concerned with questions of presumption, temperance, guidance, submission to authority. I hope this reads of time, I won't read the quotation. Unlike Phaeton, Icarus then, who disobeys his father's advice to follow a middle course between sea and sun, Dante, of course, remains guided by the paternal Virgil, and moreover has divine will and authority on his side. So again, a tragic classical tale of presumption is granted a comic resolution in light of this Christian voyage's submission to God and the comic resolution which ensues. So in Inferno 17 and Paradiso 17, Dante is setting out a series of inversions and antitheses which powerfully exemplify the defining and central characteristics of his comedy, both its plain-speaking veracity, set in opposition to Gerion's embellished mendacity, and its redemptive narrative, provenance and purpose, continually set in opposition to tragic pagan antecedents. And what of Purgatorio 17? Well, it seems only fitting that at the core of the comedy is defined the principle, amor, which enables human life, in Dante's vision, to achieve comic resolution. For numerous pagan figures referenced in the poem, love, lacking a redemptive object, was inherently hopeless and could only lead to the foul and horrible, to think back to the terms of the epistle, in tragedy, in other words. We need only think of Dido, che s'ancise amorosa, or Virgil's famous words in Limbo, senza speme vivemmo in desio, to understand the tragic tenor of love for Dante's pagans. By contrast, love for Dante becomes the comic instrument of redemption, the conduit to salvation, and the means of terminating worldly exile. This series of oppositions I've set out are not to be understood simply as evidence of the innate superiority of Dante's poetic art. Rather, they should be seen as examples of his continual and meticulous endeavour to situate himself and his poetry in relation to other writers and other modes or traditions of writing, and to illustrate how the Commedia overcomes their perceived moral, spiritual and expressive failings. Nor should the oppositions detract from the profound tensions, the oppositions which Dante presents as very stark, but the profound tensions at this poem's heart. The Commedia, as we have seen, constantly aligns itself with truth and distances itself from mendacity, at times presenting itself as no less than scriptural in its truthfulness and authority, and its author as a divinely anointed scribe. But a refusal to accept such designations might leave us with a very different proposition, radically transgressive in its operation and potentially self-serving in its convictions. Within the constructed universe of the Commedia, the relationship between Gerion and the poem is indeed straightforwardly oppositional, but a more sceptical consideration of its nature might leave us with the impression less of a false-seeming truth than a falsity which continually insists on its own veracity. And various critics have read Gerion, Arachne, Phaeton, Icarus as much more problematic points of reference for Dante, and sort of self-consciously problematic points of reference than I sort of had time to set out here. But the collective operation of the 17s is, I think, one of defying such accusations through a process of inversion and transformation. Looking back sort of down the column from the perspective of Paradiso 17, we see Gerion as everything Dante's poem is not, or claims not to be, as the Commedia's negative image. We see the tale of Phaeton entirely turned on its head, both in terms of its narrative order and its thematic principle. And we see Icaro Misero and Folle Arachne as the antitypes of pilgrim and Dante Pilgrim and Dante Poet Weaver, respectively. We see, in short, through the prism of these ancient anti-models, the defining features of a radically new sort of epic, which Dante simply calls his commedia. Thank you very much.